It's now my pleasure to introduce Helen Angear and Angelique Richardson, who come to each study day to deliver one of our most popular sessions, a seminar on the huge digitisation project that has taken place to make Hardy's correspondence available to everybody. For those who haven't met Helen and Angelique yet, Helen is a collaborative doctoral award researcher at the University of Exeter, funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council and the Dorset County Museum. That's Helen. She is working in the Hardy Archive, and in February, she successfully passed her viva with flying colours. Yay! Her PhD was entitled An Epistolary Thomas Hardy, Proximity and Distance. She's also an associate lecturer at Exeter College and a member of the Hardy Country Partnership, which currently includes quite an impressive list: the National Trust, the DCM, our Society, Bath Spa University, the University of Exeter, the Dorset Area of Outstanding Natural Beauty, whom I hope you've been following on Facebook, and you're going to join the peaceful march to protest against building on the land up there, and Kingston Morwood College. We also are very lucky to have Angelique with us. She's Professor of English at the University of Exeter. She publishes on 19th and early 20th century literature, culture and science, and is particularly interested in the history of class and race relations. She's written a number of books, some of which are Love and Eugenics in the late 19th century, Women Who Did, Stories by Men and Women 1890 to 1914, no, you edited that one. And a study of Darwin and interdisciplinarity called After Darwin, Animals, Emotions and the Mind. She is writing The Politics of Thomas Hardy for Oxford University Press as we speak, and she leads the education strategy of the Hardy Country Partnership. She also runs the Dorchester Hardy Lecture Series in collaboration with the Museum, the National Trust, Kingston Morwood College, which is where they're all taking place at the moment, and the Hardy Society. And without further ado, let me hand you over to Angelique and Helen, who will talk to us about working with the archives, far from the madding crowd at GCSE, A-Level and university. Helen and Angelique.
Thank you very much, Tracy. I'm amazed that so many of you are still here. Where do you want me to stand? Oh, so you can hear me, yes. Can you hear me now? I will not move for the duration of this session. Anyway, I'm amazed that so many of you are here. I'm also amazed I'm here because I've been in and out of A&E this week, and term ended and we nearly left the European Union twice during the period that we've been putting this together. So it's an amazing, I don't know, I can't believe we're here, but we are. And one of the things that we're going to be talking to you about today is working with archives, going into schools and universities and bringing into those spaces, certainly in schools and to public audiences, a writer who was so concerned with questions of social justice and inequality, class relations. And I think that's particularly of interest at the moment when there's been a lurch to the right. We've got Islamophobia, we've got racism rising as it hasn't been for some time. We've got David Lammy getting death threats this week. So Hardy gives us a way of being able to talk about some of those issues. This is an author who thought that patriotism shouldn't exist unless it applied to the whole globe, and that the concept of foreignness should apply to other planets only. When he talked about Western civilization, he put civilization in inverted commas on one occasion and said perhaps it's time that we give the black and Asian races a chance, and we might think about that as a predominantly white audience, how forward-thinking he was, and why this is a predominantly white audience. Maybe that's something we need to think more about. So we'll talk a bit more about the work that we're doing with archives. So this is part of a project called Hardy and Heritage. Now, all the letters that Hardy sent have been collected, and many of you will know they're in the 8-volume, 7, and then the 8th was recently co-edited with Michael Milgate and Keith Wilson, an excellent 8th volume. They're all in print, and if you're lucky enough to be affiliated to an institution of higher education, then you have access to those through the past masters. But the letters that Hardy received from a wide variety of people, from Virginia Woolf, Siegfried Sassoon, politicians, social reformers, and as Helen so eloquently discusses in her thesis, Hardy's fans. We associate the term perhaps with the 20th century and later, but Hardy had his fans, and the meet an author, as Helen brings out, the idea of meeting a celebrity, we can certainly see in the context of Hardy. So those around 5,000 letters are in Dorset County Museum, although they're not now. They're in Dorset History Centre, because the wonderfully the 11.3 million HLF grant is going towards the refurbishment of the museum now. So what we've done, we've photographed, digitised all those letters. I say we, Helen has been an absolute linchpin of that project and done huge amounts of work as part of her collaborative doctoral award. Now these, I don't like acronyms, but the acronym is CDA, but a collaborative doctoral award, part of the philosophy of that is that it's to equip PhD researchers with a variety of skills so that they're absolutely valuable not only in academia but in other areas of the cultural humanities, heritage organisations. So alongside a scholarly, rigorous PhD, she's been a member of the team at Dorset County Museum, and we've digitised all those letters. They're not going to be available for some time. There are more stages of funding applications, etc. If you think about Darwin's letters, 20,000, they've had a team for nearly 20 years, full-time 10 people, and we've got Helen, me, and our digital humanities team, and we've got various volunteers here in Dorchester, but it's nothing like the kind of number that have underpinned the Darwin project. So, of course, we've got a few more years before those will be publicly available, but we will make 100 available, and the aim is to have those available later this year, and then we were working on making the others available, and what you'll get is the photograph of the letter and also a transcription. So that's the project that this comes from. And just a little bit about some of there we have some slides of some of the organisations that inform this project, though this project in particular, the Letters Project, is a collaboration between Dorset County Museum and Exeter, our Digital Humanities Lab, a fairly new lab, 18 months now, and our Special Collections. And so those are some of the partners. I'm now the co-chair of the Hardy Country Partnership, and those are some of the partners, but the Shire Hall Museum is a new partner, so new that I haven't updated my slide. It's growing all the time. It's very, very exciting to be working with all these different organisations. There they are. Do have a look at them. They're open Sundays as well. And we also work with the National Trust. Some of you know we're running a poetry competition. Two of the judges, at least, possibly three, are in this room for schools. And the winner of that will be announced on Hardy's birthday. And there we have the History Centre. So just some of the wider questions of this project. As I say, the main focus of our session today is going to be on the work we're doing with schools, but some of the questions that are asked when you're working on a digital humanities project, I'm going to take you through those. Oh, and there's just a list of some of the writers, I mentioned a few, that we have the privilege to read work from when working on this project. So these are some of the questions that we ask, some of the research questions. What digital humanities allows us to do is reconstruct networks which enhance the prosopographical content of traditional scholarly editions. So it's worth remembering when you're working on a project like this, which has digital humanities at its heart, what we really mean by that is a flexibility, a fluidity. Once something is in a book, it's fixed, it sits on a shelf. It's probably why the Encyclopaedia Britannica has more kudos and prestige than Wikipedia. I think Wikipedia is much, much better. It has far fewer errors. It's updated all the time, but in a rather middle-class way, because the Encyclopaedia Britannica sits on shelves and it's quite expensive. People give it more prestige and respect, so we might want to consider that. Anyone here who's a teacher and tells your students not to look at Wikipedia, I would urge them to look at Wikipedia, but I would suggest that they use it as a portal and obviously not cite it, because it's a wonderful way into other sources and a very good starting point. And quite often, sometimes my students will write Wikipedia entries on some of their correspondents who, should have entries and don't. And so, if you don't like Wikipedia, then make it better, contribute to it. That's one of the wonders of that kind of collaborative work. So the networks that we look at in digital humanities, as I say, there's a flexibility. You can always add things if you're working on a digital humanities project. It's not just sitting on a shelf. And through links between the sender and the addressee, as well as internal links to different people referenced within the letters, it's been possible to reconstruct social and cultural networks. It's something that I'm looking at in my book, and something that Helen wonderfully illustrates through her thesis. Her thesis really is a testimony to the kind of work that you can do with digital humanities scholarship. And working with TEI and linked open data allows us to restore the content of an epistolary conversation. And while we're talking about dialogues, we are in dialogue with Oxford University Press about the possibilities of maybe linking, once it's complete, our version with the letters from Hardy, so those dialogues can be reconstructed. So just a little bit about the research contexts of this project. So critical study, of course, and reception of Hardy, editorial practice in Victorian studies, and the field of text and digital editing, digital scholarship in literary studies. And as I say, once you have access to those letters, what you'll see is the photographed letter and the transcribed text. So what do we do when we're bringing letters in, opening up the archives to younger students? And this is where Helen is going to take over.
Thanks. So one of the initial ways that we've thought about opening up the archives is to go in to work with post-16 students when they're doing their coursework. And we've worked with a college in Devon. So recent changes to the A-levels, which came into effect from 2015, reduced the coursework weighting from 40% of their overall grade down to 20%. And students typically produce just one extended essay. And we've been working with edXcel for their way of kind of looking at A-level English literature from 2015. So we feel that it's a really important opportunity for students to develop their skills as independent inquirers. And exam boards don't specify whether coursework should be poetry, drama or prose, but most centres usually choose the kind of prose options. So at a college in Devon, We have, where I'm an associate lecturer, we have the literature team who have decided that they will offer students 19th and 20th century texts as coursework options. So Hardy, Far from the Madding Crowd, is the text at the moment, and that's offered alongside Wuthering Heights, Jane Eyre, The French Lieutenant's Woman, The Remains of the Day, and Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit. So when students see this list, they have taster sessions on each of the texts, and then they're asked to pick two that they need to compare. And they need to do that individually, independently, and they generate their own essay questions. So we thought about opening up the archives when they're becoming these independent investigative students. And as we've digitised the Hardy archive, we identified several letters that would be relevant to students at college who are studying Far from the Madding Crowd. And this is an interesting one. It's from the serial editor Leslie Stephen. It's a great way for students to start thinking about the letter as a material object, because with the collection, they're in very good condition, the letters, and most of them are intact. But this one opens up questions and ideas because the first part of page one is missing. So it gets them thinking, and it really kind of, they can sort of question it, interrogate it, and that's what we like to open up, really. So the aim was to introduce archival study into the A-level curriculum to stretch and challenge the level of independent inquiry that students feel comfortable undertaking. Because there's a tendency for students to seek a narrow range of secondary sources to support their study of a text when they're doing it independently, we felt that it would possibly make them feel that there was an established set of interpretations about any given novel. We wanted them to kind of really challenge that. So we wanted to ask, how could primary material encourage students to be inquisitive researchers, pursuing their own independent and possibly original lines of inquiry? And so, as we've seen, we have these two kind of partners, the University of Exeter and Dorset County Museum, and there's great potential for museums and universities to develop these partnerships with local schools and colleges as well, so that you can create bespoke resources using the archives and other special collections that draw on the interests of the teachers, the students, and local cultural heritage. So, by working both in a college and at the university, I've been able to encourage students to book sessions with the Special Collections team at the University of Exeter. And it's only actually a 10-minute walk up a hill between the college and the university. But none of the students had really thought that that was something they could do, that they could go in there and actually say, can I request to see your fantastic Victorian collection, your heritage collections, your periodicals, your illustrated newspapers. They didn't think that that was something that was available and accessible to them. And so we've encouraged them to go independently, book sessions, call material up from kind of the collections and the archives. And that's a really important way for them to extend their understanding of the context of studying Hardy or the Victorian period. And to support that, we've also been doing some digitisation of the material that's useful to support remote study of and exploration. So we've also thought about those letters that we identified that were particularly useful for Far from the Madding Crowd, and they're very good as discussion prompts. So we do give the students the handwritten letters first, and then we support that with kind of transcripts, but we help them to see that they can produce their own transcripts and support that kind of development. But when we've worked with several letters, we found that the ones from Leslie Stephen, written to Hardy during that kind of serialisation process, were very useful. So in this letter, written on the 12th of March 1874, Stephen advises Hardy to treat Troy's seduction of the young woman in a gingerly fashion. And that's an effective way for students to start to examine relationships between characters, gender, censorship, and reader expectations of the time. And we encourage them to compare the serial version with their own copies of the novel to see how it changed and developed. And alongside letters from Leslie Stephen, we also show students another letter from a fellow writer, Catherine McCoyd, in which she discusses Hardy's characterisation of Bathsheba. And we really want them to think about this. It's a very long letter, it's very challenging for them, and so I've just selected a short quotation here. But we find it's important for students to think about what contemporary female readers and writers were responding to about Bathsheba as a female character. And then we also get students to compare that to 21st century reader responses. And so the 2015 film adaptation has been useful because Carrie Mulligan, if you go onto YouTube, which we can't show you here because it's not connected up, but she actually discusses her response to playing Bathsheba. And so that's a very useful comparison with this letter. And so it's thinking about the two time periods and the readers and writers and how they're responding to her. And thinking about that letter in a bit more detail, just take you over to the university study of Far from the Madding Crowd as well.
Thank you. As if you look at our website for Hardy and Heritage, there's various blog pieces on that by people who've used the archive in some way or been connected to it. And there's a very nice piece by one of my third-year undergraduates, Chrissy Lewis. She used the archive of the letters for her dissertation, and she talks about how it allowed her to have a much more intimate understanding of Far from the Madding Crowd, and just to give her a real sense of the public engagements of the Victorians with Hardy. So do take a look at that. There's a very nice piece as well by Peter Faulkner, emeritus at Exeter. Helen's talked about the letter from Catherine McCoyd and the sort of questions that raises for questions about gender fluidity, sexual identity, again, in a climate where students will be very interested to talk about these sorts of issues. I mean, we've had a recent rise in homophobia and hate crimes. So again, issues that are really, really important to them can be addressed through this collection. It's quite interesting, the letter from Catherine McCoyd that there's a letter from Hardy that you'll find in the printed volume, and she'd obviously written to him before that because he writes to her in April thanking her for her letter and saying the question of whether women of ordinary types should or should not be depicted as the heroines of novels is such a nice one that it is difficult to discuss it in writing. So that characteristic disavowal from Hardy, but he says, I myself, I must confess, I've no great liking for the perfect woman in fiction, but this may be for purely artistic reasons. And he discusses real-life women and says that he hopes that Bathsheba, with all her errors, was not devoid of honesty of this kind. It is, however, a point for the readers to decide. So the very nice paper we had just before this one, which looked at teenage responses, it would be great if those some of those students could have a look at these two letters. That would be a way of sort of broadening that discussion out. So I'm going to hand back to you now, I think. But lots of scope for work with university students as well as school students.
And our last stage of kind of where we've been working in schools and colleges is to think about how archives and special collections can be opened up to younger students, key stages 3 and 4. And so, again, with changes to the GCSE, in this case the GCSE English language that students now sit, it includes 19th century texts as unseen material in exams, and that can be seen as quite challenging. However, rising to the challenge also brings rewards, and obviously there's genuine value in accessing new texts from some of the most exciting moments of history. So it's been another positive in that schools can collaborate with universities and cultural heritage organisations, which are bursting at the seams with fascinating and underused historical archives and special collections. We identified that AQA, the exam boards AQA and OCR, were using 19th and 20th century non-fiction texts in their exams, and so Hardy's letters and the letters written to Hardy were ideal material to get students to kind of think about the material object of the letter and non-fiction within a context of dialogue. We've got to the point where, and this is kind of just one screenshot, but if you go onto the Hardy and Heritage website, then you can access an electronic digital resource that supports study of 19th and 20th century non-fiction. It can be used at GCSE level, and certainly the questions we've generated are fitting for GCSE, but it can also be used by younger students, and we've tested it out with A-level as well. And some great illustrations created by the illustrator Jamie White to make it more accessible. The focus for our initial digital resource was Hardy and animals, so hence why we have our Victorian kitten. But this was because we were noticing that Hardy's letters, there was a lot of discussion with various people about animal welfare, and we wanted to bring that theme out. And we also used the University of Exeter's special collections to take news articles from the Graphic, the illustrated newspaper, the Graphic, to look at what Hardy and his contemporaries would have been reading about animal issues. So we combine the two. And that offers new ways of reading Hardy, whether it's kind of studying Far From the Madding Crowd or whether it's reading his letters as non-fiction texts. It offers students the chance to read articles that Hardy and his original readers would have encountered, so it enhances understanding of context. And that selected theme of animals draws attention to Hardy's involvement in animal welfare, and it supports reciprocity between teaching of English language and literature, because it provides additional ways of tackling comprehension and context. And it's still very relevant to the study of Far From the Madding Crowd. Now, as that's one resource, and we might think about developing a whole range of resources on various themes, then we could use some of the Far From the Madding Crowd letters to look at Hardy and gender as perhaps the next step in a new resource. And we recently published an article in Times Educational Supplement discussing kind of the work that we've been doing, so that's something if you want to kind of follow up and find out a little bit more and kind of keep track with our progress on it. And so we do have some letters, the letters that the students would look at. We do have those to share with you. So we've got them reproduced, and it's just a kind of opportunity for you to kind of read and discuss. And one of them is particularly long. It's 8 pages, so you might want to kind of take that away and read it later in your kind of own leisure. But we'll show you first the one from Leslie Stephen, where he's advising Hardy about Troy's seduction and how to treat it in a gingerly fashion. So his seduction.
Sophie and Amy, do you want to do some handing out? So yesterday I had the privilege of working with the Modern Diseases group from the University of Oxford. Some members of the Exeter University team worked with Oxford yesterday. We ran a workshop for teachers, and it was great to have more. The resource was designed through collaboration with teachers, and it was great to just have a chance to work again with teachers. Are there any teachers in the audience today? Brilliant. Okay, I asked mainly because I know was that obviously schools are suffering from huge numbers of cuts. You can just find the statistics very easily. But it's not an easy time for the teaching profession, and some of the reforms introduced by Gove also were not welcome, and this actually, the change to GCSE to bring in unseen fictional and non-fictional texts was kind of one step too many for a lot of students who are already struggling, a lot of mental health issues, stress, in disadvantaged areas. So one of the things we wanted to do was just provide some support for those teachers and schools, online free support for finding some of the resources. And also there's a new, relatively new concept in schools of enhancement. So it's encouraging children who might not otherwise get to go out to museums and other cultural heritage organisations to do that and go and see some of these resources in situ. So that's one of the ways in which this resource has encouraged that.
Okay, thank you very much to Helen and Angelique for the seminar.